22 years of marriage, and I never once went through my wife's phone. Not once. I tell you that not to sound noble, but because you need to understand what kind of man I was before the night of Tom and Carol's anniversary dinner, when I reached into my wife's coat pocket to grab her keys and pulled out a receipt for a hotel room booked under her name and a man who wasn't me. My name is Richard Calloway. I'm 54 years old. I own a structural engineering firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, that I built from a two-man operation in a rented office above a dry cleaner to a team of 31 people with contracts across the Southeast. I am not a dramatic man. I don't raise my voice. I don't make scenes. I solve problems with blueprints and load calculations and patience, and I applied that same methodical calm to the worst 18 months of my life, my wife. I'll call her my wife throughout this, because that's what she was, legally and in every other sense, until the court said otherwise, had been a family law attorney for the better part of 2 decades. She was sharp, relentless in a courtroom, and the kind of woman who could walk into any room and immediately become the most interesting person in it. I fell in love with her at 29 when she was a third-year associate barely sleeping, surviving on takeout and ambition. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony at her parents' lake house in Lake Norman. Her mother cried. My father gave a toast that went on 11 minutes longer than it should have. It was perfect. We have 2 sons. Marcus is 19 now, finishing his first year at NC State. Caleb just turned 16, plays left wing on his club soccer team, and can eat an amount of food that I still find genuinely alarming. For the longest stretch of our marriage, the 4 of us were solid. We had rhythms and routines. We had a house that felt like a home. We had inside jokes and Sunday morning pancakes, and a tradition of watching bad disaster movies on New Year's Eve. The trouble, and I say trouble because calling it what it actually was still takes a breath, started about 2 years before everything collapsed. My wife made partner at her firm. It was something she had worked toward for over a decade, and I was genuinely proud of her. I threw her a dinner party. I toasted her in front of our friends and meant every word. But the promotion came with a particular client, a real estate developer named Grant, who brought in enough billable hours to keep 3 associates busy year-round. She began handling his portfolio almost exclusively. I didn't think much of it at first. She'd always had demanding clients. The late nights weren't new. The weekend calls weren't new. What was new, and what I noticed gradually the way you notice water damage on a ceiling, slowly, then all at once, was the specific quality of her distraction. She wasn't tired the way she used to be tired. She was elsewhere. She could be sitting across from me at dinner and I'd feel the conversation bouncing off something invisible between us. When I tried to talk about anything that mattered, her attention would drift toward her phone like a compass needle toward north. His name came up naturally at first. Grant this, Grant that. Grant had a problem with the zoning board. Grant was navigating a messy acquisition. Grant had a daughter who went to school with Caleb, which meant they'd cross paths at school events, which meant nothing, and which my wife mentioned exactly once in a way that felt very deliberately casual. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was 52 years old with a good life and a wife who'd been loyal for 22 years. I had no hard evidence of anything. I had a feeling, a quiet, persistent feeling that I kept talking myself out of because I didn't want to be the kind of man who accuses his wife of something terrible based on nothing but a vague unease in his chest. But I'm also an engineer. I deal in load-bearing realities and the structure of my marriage. I could feel it. Had a crack in it somewhere I couldn't see. The first concrete thing happened about 14 months ago. I came home from a site visit in Raleigh earlier than expected on a Thursday afternoon, and found my wife on the back deck, phone pressed to her ear, laughing in a way I hadn't heard her laugh with me in a long time. It wasn't the laugh itself. It was the way it stopped the instant she saw me through the glass door. The way her posture changed, shoulders pulling inward, hand going to her collarbone. She wrapped up the call quickly, came inside, said it was a client issue. I said okay. I kissed her on the cheek. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the quiet. After that, I started paying attention differently. Not suspiciously, not angrily, just carefully. I'm a careful man by nature. I began keeping track of small things in my head the way I track discrepancies in a structural report. A text notification she angled away from me. A business trip to Atlanta that she'd never mentioned having until the morning she left for it. A name she stopped saying out loud even though the client were still clearly very much part of her daily work. I didn't snoop. I didn't check her phone while she slept or install anything on her laptop. I want to be clear about that. What I did instead was make an appointment with a private investigator named Dennis, who had an unremarkable office on the second floor of a building downtown, and a manner so deliberately ordinary that I had to remind myself he was very good at what he did. I told Dennis what I suspected. I told him the name. I told him I needed to know the truth before I made any decisions, because I had a 16-year-old son still living at home, and a marriage of 22 years, and I wasn't going to blow any of it up based on a feeling. Dennis came back to me 6 weeks later with photographs, credit card statements, and a log of dates and locations. A hotel in Uptown, a restaurant in South Park where they'd never go if they were worried about running into people who knew them, except someone had recognized her and mentioned it to a mutual acquaintance, which is how it had reached Dennis in the first place. There were 6 documented meetings over 4 months. I sat in Dennis's office and looked at everything. I kept my hands flat on the desk. I thanked him. I paid the invoice. I drove to my office, closed my door, and stared out the window at the Charlotte skyline for about 40 minutes. Then I called my attorney. Not a divorce attorney yet, my business attorney, a woman named Sandra who had handled every contract and LLC structure and property agreement I'd accumulated over 20 years. I told her I needed a referral to the best matrimonial attorney in Mecklenburg County, and I needed it to be someone who understood high-asset situations and didn't flinch easily. She gave me a name within the hour. I met with that attorney, a methodical man named Philip, the following week. I showed him everything Dennis had compiled. Philip reviewed it with the expression of a man reading a tax document rather than evidence of an affair, which is exactly the quality I needed in someone handling my interests. North Carolina is an at-fault divorce state, he told me. Alienation of affection and criminal conversation are still actionable here. What you have is more than sufficient to file on fault grounds. The question is, what you want to do with it and when. I told him I needed time. I had reasons to wait. Philip nodded and told me to call him when I was ready. I went home that night and made dinner. My wife came in around 7, said she'd had a long day, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat on the couch to decompress. I brought her a bowl of pasta. She said thank you. We watched half of something on television. She fell asleep before it ended. I sat next to her in the quiet and understood with great clarity that the woman I had loved for most of my adult life had made a series of choices that had nothing to do with me, and that I could not fix what I had not broken. What I did not do, through all of this, was confront her. Not yet. Philip had advised me strongly against it. Confrontation changes behavior, he said. It makes people careful. It destroys the documentary advantage you currently have. I understood the logic. I followed it, even though there were evenings when it cost me something I couldn't name to sit across from her and say nothing. 3 months passed that way. Then Tom and Carol announced they were throwing a party for their 30th anniversary. Tom had been my closest friend since graduate school. Carol and my wife had been close for almost as long. It was at the Ballantine Hotel, a dinner for about 40 people. The kind of evening where everyone dresses up and tells the same stories they've been telling for years and means it more each time. My wife was excited about it in a way she hadn't been excited about. A social event in a way she hadn't been excited about a social event in a long time. She bought a new dress. She made a hair appointment. The morning of, she was up early, which wasn't unusual. But there was an energy to her that I recognized. Not excitement about seeing Tom and Carol. Something else underneath it. Something that pulled her attention toward her phone 3 times before I'd finished my coffee. I said nothing. I dressed. We drove to the hotel together. She talked the whole way about Carol's kids and Tom's new boat and which of their mutual friends would be there. I responded in all the right places. I am, when I need to be, a very good listener. The dinner was lovely. The speeches were warm. Tom cried twice and pretended he wasn't. My wife sat beside me, touched my arm at appropriate moments, laughed at the right jokes. To anyone watching, we were a couple in good shape. I knew the performance she was giving, and I gave my own version of it back to her. We were, in that room, perfectly matched. About an hour in, she excused herself to the ladies' room. As she stood, she handed me her coat, which she'd had draped over her chair. "Will you hang this on the hook behind you?" she said. I took it, reached into the pocket to straighten it before hanging it, the way you do. My fingers closed around a folded piece of paper and what felt like a key card. I waited until she was gone. Then I looked. The paper was a receipt. A hotel receipt. One of the smaller boutique hotels in the city. Printed that afternoon. 2 nights. Her name and a credit card I didn't recognize. Which meant a card I didn't recognize. Which meant a card I didn't know about. Which was its own revelation. The key card was in a small envelope with the room number written on it in pen. My heart rate went up exactly once. Then it leveled out. I put both items back in the coat pocket, straightened it on the hook, and sat back down. She returned. She put her hand over mine on the table. I smiled at her. When dinner wrapped up and people were saying their goodbyes in the lobby, I excused myself to the men's room. I took a photograph of the receipt and the key card with my phone. Sent them to Philip's email with a single line. Needed you to have this before Monday. Then I went back out, found my wife talking to Carol, and waited. In the car on the way home, she said it had been a beautiful evening. I agreed. She said Tom's toast was sweet. I agreed. She said we should do something like that for our 25th, coming up in 3 years. I said that sounded nice. 2 days later, I was sitting in Philip's office with Dennis's full report and the new photographs when Philip walked me through the filing timeline. We were ready. I told him to proceed. The papers were served to my wife on a Tuesday morning and her firm. I was told later. I heard it from a secretary who had worked for my wife's firm for 12 years and who had never liked her very much. That she turned the color of chalk when the process server walked through the reception area. That she had to excuse herself from a client meeting. That she sat in her office for 40 minutes without moving before calling anyone. She called me first. I let it go to voicemail. The message was about 4 minutes long and moved through confusion, disbelief, and then something that sounded like it was heading toward anger. Before she seemed to catch herself. She asked me to call her. She said we needed to talk. She said she didn't understand why I had done this without warning. I called her back that evening from the kitchen, standing at the counter while Caleb was upstairs doing homework. I think you understand exactly why, I said. There was a long pause. Can we talk in person? We can, but not tonight. She came to the house the following evening. I told Caleb in advance that his mother and I needed to have a private conversation and asked him to go to a friend's house for a few hours. He looked at me the way 16-year-olds look at their parents when they understand more than their parents think they do. He nodded, picked up his bag, and left without asking questions. She sat down at the kitchen table. I sat across from her. She started with the word blindsided, which I found interesting. You weren't blindsided, I said. You were caught. She didn't say anything for a moment. How long have you known? She asked. Long enough to do this properly? She tried several approaches over the next hour. The marriage had been struggling. I was emotionally unavailable. Her work made her feel unseen. Grant understood her in ways that she and I had stopped finding each other. None of it was an excuse, she said, but I needed to understand the context. I listened to all of it. I am a patient man. And I had had months to prepare for this conversation, which meant I had no anger left for it. What I felt sitting across from her was something quieter and harder to name. Grief, maybe. Grief. For the version of her I had believed in for 22 years, which had turned out to be partially constructed. I don't need the context, I said when she finished. What I needed was a wife who talked to me instead of someone else. That window is closed, she cried. I handed her a box of tissues and waited. What about Caleb? She asked. Caleb lives in the house his grandfather helped me build. He's not going anywhere. You can't just decide. I'm not deciding anything. I'm telling you what Caleb wants, because I know our son. You can confirm it with him directly. She did. 2 days later, she called Caleb and asked him what he wanted to do. He told her he wanted to stay with me. He told her he wanted to stay with me. He told her he wasn't angry. He was just clear. He said it the way young men say difficult things when they've had time to think about them, with a simplicity that is its own kind of heartbreak. She called me afterward and cried again. I told her Caleb loved her and that this was a hard situation for everyone and that our job as his parents was to make it as stable as we could. She said yes. She said she was sorry. I told her I believed her. Marcus came home from school for a weekend about a month into the process. He sat in the kitchen with me on a Friday night and asked me to tell him what happened, without softening it into something easier to hear. I told him. He sat with it for a while, poured himself more coffee, looked out the window at the backyard where we taught him to throw a baseball when he was 5 years old. Is she sorry? He asked. I think she's sorry about the consequences, I said. I think she might also be genuinely sorry about what she did to our family. Both things can be true. Marcus nodded slowly. That's a fair answer. I try. You looked at me. Are you okay, Dad? I had to think about that one honestly. I'm getting there, I said. Ask me in a year. The legal process took 8 months. Philip was thorough and methodical and exactly what I needed. The discovery phase turned up the credit card, which had been used to fund a pattern of expenses across 14 months. Philip filed the alienation of affection claim against Grant in addition to the divorce proceedings, which is a tactic that some attorneys advise against and that Philip advised strongly for. Given what we had, Grant's own attorney settled it quickly and quietly, which told me everything I needed to know about how afraid he was of it going further. What happened at her firm was not my doing, but I also did not prevent it. The senior partners were informed through their own internal channels, which I understand is the kind of thing that happens when a partner is named in legal proceedings that involve a significant client. She was placed on a performance review. The partnership track she had been on for 3 years was suspended pending the outcome of the proceedings. A colleague, who had been quietly competing with her for a senior role, was offered the position instead. I heard this from Tom, who had heard it from Carol, who had heard it from someone at my wife's gym who worked in legal recruiting. Tom relayed it with the careful neutrality of someone who is your friend, but also trying not to take sides. I told him I appreciated the information and that I held no satisfaction in her professional consequences. This was not entirely true, but it was the right thing to say to a man who had been friends with both of us for 25 years and had to keep living in the same city as both of us afterward. The settlement gave me primary custody of Caleb. The house stayed with me and the boys. My firm's ownership structure, which Philip and Sandra had spent considerable time ring-fencing in the early stages, was not substantially affected. My wife retained her retirement accounts and the lake property her parents had left her. The division was not equal by every measure, but the judge was not moved to generosity towards someone whose own legal filings had documented 14 months of conduct. Grant, I was told by Dennis in a brief follow-up call I didn't strictly need but paid for anyway because I wanted to know, had been quietly separated from his wife before my case was filed. Her attorney had apparently been watching the same situation I had, with fewer photographs, but sufficient cause. His real estate development projects in the city had a period of financing difficulty around the same time. I don't know the details and I didn't look for them. It's been almost a year since the divorce was finalized. My firm had its best fiscal year on record. I signed 2 new contracts in the spring, a mixed-use development in Uptown and a school renovation project in Gastonia that I took partly because the money was good and partly because I like building things that children will use for the next 40 years. There is something clarifying about work. It has always been that for me, but this past year it has been more than that. It has been the proof of what I am outside of the marriage I was in, the reminder that I have made real things in the world that stand up and hold weight. Caleb is doing well. He made the regional select team for soccer, which required a schedule adjustment that I handled by rearranging 3 client meetings and driving to Greensboro at 6 in the morning on a Saturday and standing in the cold for 2 hours watching him play with everything he had. He told me on the drive home that he was sorry our family was different now. I told him that family isn't a fixed structure. It's a set of people who show up for each other, and that on that measure our family was intact. He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "That's actually kind of smart, Dad." I told him I occasionally managed it. Marcus came home for summer and we spent 3 weeks repainting the garage and arguing about music and eating unreasonable quantities of barbecue. On his last night before driving back to school, he sat on the back porch with me and said he'd been thinking about what I told him months ago, about his mother being sorry in 2 different ways at once. "I think I get it now," he said. "It's like a building with a bad foundation. It doesn't mean the building wasn't real. It just means something underneath wasn't holding." I looked at him. He's going to be a fine engineer if he wants to be, or a fine anything else. "That's exactly right," I said. "The house feels different than it did 2 years ago, but not worse. Different the way a room feels after you take out a piece of furniture that was blocking a window. There's more light in some places. The weekends are quieter, which took some adjusting to. I've started cooking more. Not out of necessity, but because I discovered I'm actually not bad at it, which is the kind of thing you learn about yourself when your life creates space for you to look. Tom and Carol have had me over for dinner 3 times since the divorce. Carol cooked. Tom and I sat in the backyard after eating and talked the way we talked when we were 30, which is to say honestly and without performance. He asked me once, carefully, whether I was lonely. I told him the truth, which is that I spent 18 months being lonely inside a marriage, and that being alone in my own house with my sons coming and going and my work going well, and a life I had built myself with my own hands felt nothing like loneliness. It felt, most mornings, like the first clear weather after a very long front had passed through. I'm not in a rush to be anything other than what I am right now. I'm 54, I'm healthy, I have 2 sons I'm proud of, and a business that reflects 20 years of work I believe in. I don't know what the next chapter looks like, and I've stopped needing to. For a long time, I thought the structure of my life was built around my marriage. And when that structure showed the cracks, I was afraid to know what would be left standing underneath. What standing is enough, more than enough. I built it, and it holds.